Have you ever stopped to wonder why, in an era of unprecedented connectivity, millions of people wake up every morning feeling a deep emptiness in their chest, a sensation that they are fundamentally disconnected from the world around them? Why, despite having more communication tools than any previous generation, so many adults live in silent and desperate isolation? The answer to this question is not found in social media algorithms or the complexities of modern life. It is buried in the deepest layers of our formation as human beings in those first years of life when our capacity for connection was shaped by experiences that many of us cannot even consciously remember. Today, I want to explore with you a truth that our society prefers to ignore. How emotional wounds from childhood not only influence, but literally program our ability to form meaningful bonds in adult life, creating patterns of isolation that we perpetuate without understanding their origins. Imagine a 5-year-old child who learns through repeated experiences that expressing their emotional needs results in rejection, neglect, or punishment. This child is not just going through a difficult time. They are receiving a fundamental education about how the world works, about what it means to be vulnerable, and about the risks of seeking genuine connection. Each ignored tear, each rejected request for attention, each moment when their feelings are minimized or ridiculed is engraving in their developing nervous system a powerful lesson. Connection is dangerous. Vulnerability is weakness, and safety lies in isolation. This is not an abstract theory from psychology. It is a neurobiological reality documented by decades of research on child development and neuroplasticity. For thousands of years, human societies organized themselves around structures that naturally provided children with multiple attachment figures and emotional safety nets. Hunter-gatherer tribes raised their children in communities where each adult had some level of responsibility for the emotional well-being of all children. There was no modern concept of the isolated nuclear family where one or two people are completely responsible for the complex emotional development of a child. When a child faced difficulties with their biological parents, there were grandparents, uncles, aunts, tribal elders, and other adults who could offer alternative models of relationship and emotional support. The system was naturally redundant, providing multiple opportunities for the child to learn about trust, safety, and healthy connection. The agricultural revolution began to fragment these structures, but it was really the Industrial Revolution that created the isolated nuclear family model we know today. For the first time in human history, we began raising children in small and often dysfunctional family units, where the unresolved traumas of parents were transmitted directly to the next generation without the natural support systems that had existed for millennia. Imagine what it means for a child to grow up in a house where the only available relationship models are parents who themselves never learn to regulate their emotions, communicate their needs, or form secure bonds. It is like trying to learn to navigate using only a defective map without access to other sources of guidance. What makes this situation particularly tragic is that emotional wounds from childhood are not like physical wounds that heal with time. They become part of the child's neurological architecture, influencing how the brain processes emotions, interprets social signals, and responds to stress and intimacy. A child who grows up with emotionally unavailable parents does not just learn to deal with rejection, they learn to anticipate rejection, to interpret neutrality as hostility, and to protect themselves from the pain of future disappointments by maintaining emotional distance from other people. These are not conscious choices the child makes. They are automatic adaptations that the brain develops to survive in an emotionally unsafe environment. When this child becomes an adult, they carry within them a hyperactive emotional alarm system that was calibrated by experiences of helplessness and rejection. Approaching another person, even in a positive way, activates this alarm system, creating sensations of anxiety, vulnerability, and danger that are very real to the nervous system, even if they do not correspond to the reality of the current situation. This is why so many adults report feeling lonelier when they are in relationships than when they are alone. Physical and emotional proximity activates the old wounds, creating a state of hypervigilance that makes genuine intimacy almost impossible. What our digital age has done is offer an apparently perfect solution to this dilemma. Social networks, dating apps, and virtual communication forms allow us to maintain an illusion of connection while remaining fundamentally safe behind our emotional barriers. We can have hundreds of online friends. We can exchange constant messages. We can even have intimate virtual relationships, all without ever running the real risk of the genuine vulnerability that old wounds taught us to fear. It is a brilliant solution to the wrong problem. Instead of healing the wounds that prevent us from connecting, we found increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid having to face them. But the human brain evolved over millions of years to thrive through face-to-face connection, through physical contact, emotional synchrony, and the genuine presence of other human beings. No amount of Instagram likes or WhatsApp messages can satisfy this fundamental need. In fact, these superficial forms of connection often intensify our sense of isolation because they constantly show us the contrast between what we are receiving and what our nervous system really needs to feel safe and connected. The irony is that we live in a society that constantly tells us to get over our traumas, to leave the past behind, to choose to be happy. But childhood wounds are not choices we can simply decide to abandon. They are real alterations in how our brain processes emotional and social information. It is like telling someone with a broken leg to simply choose to walk normally. The problem is not in willpower, it is in the need for real healing and restructuring of the neurological patterns that were established during the formative years. Here is a truth that can be both liberating and frightening. Most of us have no idea what our childhood was really like. We tend to remember the dramatic events, the moments of obvious trauma, but it is the hundreds of small daily interactions that most deeply shape our capacity for connection. The way our caregivers reacted when we cried, how they responded to our attempts to seek comfort, how they handled their own emotions in our presence, how they navigated conflicts and stress. These are the experiences that programmed our adult capacity to trust, to be vulnerable, and to form secure bonds. A child who grew up with parents who consistently invalidated their feelings learns that their emotions are not trustworthy or important. This child becomes an adult who has difficulty identifying and communicating their own emotional needs, which makes intimate relationships extremely challenging. A child who grew up walking on eggshells around their parents' unpredictable moods learns that relationships are emotional minefields where one wrong move can result in explosion and abandonment. This child becomes an adult who lives in a state of hypervigilance in relationships, constantly analyzing danger signals and preparing for the inevitable abandonment. What makes this situation even more complex is that these patterns are often unconscious. We do not wake up in the morning thinking, today I will sabotage my relationships because of my childhood wounds. Instead, we simply find ourselves repeating the same destructive patterns, attracting the same types of problematic people, or running from the same situations that could offer us genuine intimacy and connection. Our brain is simply executing the programs that were installed during our first years of life, programs that were designed to protect us in an environment that no longer exists. The digital revolution has intensified this problem in ways we are only beginning to understand. Children who grow up with parents addicted to digital devices are experiencing forms of emotional neglect that are subtle but deeply harmful. When a child tries to communicate with a parent who is constantly distracted by phone notifications, they learn that they are not interesting enough to deserve full attention. When a child sees their parents more emotionally engaged with their screens than with the family, they internalize the message that real relationships are less important and gratifying than virtual connections. We are raising a generation of children who are learning about relationships through parents who themselves are struggling with technology, addiction, digital anxiety, and the inability to be genuinely present. These children are developing an even greater tolerance for emotional isolation because it is all they know. They are learning that relationships are superficial transactions mediated by screens, not profound experiences of connection, vulnerability, and mutual support. But perhaps the most tragic part of all this is how our society misinterprets the symptoms of childhood trauma. When an adult struggles with depression, anxiety, addiction, or dysfunctional relationships, we tend to see these as individual problems that require individual solutions. We prescribe medications, recommend individual therapy, suggest lifestyle changes, as if isolation and dysfunction were personal choices instead of adaptive responses to emotionally unsafe environments during formative years. The truth is that the epidemic of isolation we see in modern society is not a coincidence or an inevitable consequence of technological progress. It is the predictable result of decades of raising children in emotionally impoverished environments, where basic needs for safety, connection, and validation were not consistently met. Every isolated adult we see today was once a child who tried to connect and was somehow wounded in the process. I want to pause here and ask directly, Do you recognize any of these patterns in your own life? Those moments when you feel inexplicably anxious, when someone tries to get emotionally close, the tendency to sabotage relationships when they begin to become genuinely intimate, the feeling that you are fundamentally different or separate from other people, even in the midst of crowds? I know it can be painful to recognize these tendencies in ourselves, because we often carry shame about our inability to connect the way we see others doing. But I want you to know that if you recognize these patterns, you are not alone, and more importantly, you are not broken. Your nervous system is simply operating according to the programming it received during your most vulnerable years. Share in the comments, I recognize in myself the pattern of. Your courage in naming these patterns can help other people understand that they are not alone in their struggles, and that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward real healing. Understanding the origins of our isolation is not about blaming our parents or reliving past traumas. In fact, it is about something much more powerful: recognizing that our current relationship patterns are not personality flaws or personal inadequacies, but intelligent adaptive responses to circumstances that our childhood brain interpreted as threatening. This understanding frees us from shame and opens us to the possibility of genuine healing. What modern neuroscience shows us is that the brain maintains its capacity for change and healing throughout life. The patterns established in childhood are powerful, but they are not permanent. Through repeated experiences of safety, acceptance, and genuine connection, it is possible to literally rewrite the neural programming that keeps us trapped in patterns of isolation. But this process requires much more than willpower or positive thinking. It requires corrective relational experiences that demonstrate to our nervous system that connection can be safe. This is where we find both the tragedy and the hope of our current situation. The tragedy is that many of us will spend our entire lives without ever experiencing the kind of safe and nurturing connection that our brain needs to heal. We will continue repeating the patterns learned in childhood, transmitting our unresolved wounds to our own children, perpetuating cycles of isolation and dysfunction that extend through generations. The hope lies in the growing understanding that this healing is possible and that it is never too late to begin. But healing from attachment trauma does not happen in isolation. By definition, relational wounds require relational experiences to heal. This means finding people, whether they are specialized therapists, support groups, conscious friends, or healing communities, who can offer the kind of safe and consistent presence that our childhood brain needed but did not receive. It means learning to tolerate vulnerability gradually, in small doses, while building evidence that connection can be safe. One of the most important discoveries from trauma research is that we do not necessarily need to relive or process every painful childhood experience to heal. What our nervous system needs are repeated experiences that contradict the old lessons about danger and rejection. Each time someone truly sees us and accepts us, each time we manage to express a need and receive a compassionate response, each time we experience conflict that is resolved with respect and care, we are creating new neural pathways that can eventually become stronger than the old patterns. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this understanding is how it changes our perspective on personal responsibility and collective healing. If we understand that epidemic isolation in our society is not an individual failure, but the result of systematic child-rearing practices that do not meet children's basic emotional needs, then the solution cannot be merely individual. We need to reimagine how we create communities that support healthy emotional development, how we raise children so that their attachment needs are consistently met, and how we offer healing to the millions of adults who carry unresolved childhood wounds. This requires a fundamental shift in how we think about success and social priorities. Instead of measuring progress only through economic or technological metrics, we need to begin valuing and measuring our collective capacity to create healthy relationships, to support children's emotional development, and to offer healing to those who have been wounded. We need to recognize that a society full of emotionally wounded and isolated adults cannot be truly prosperous, no matter how advanced its technology or how robust its economy. The pandemic offered us a dramatic demonstration of how fundamental human connection is to our health and well-being. During periods of forced social isolation, we saw dramatic increases in depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide. But for many people who were already living with deep emotional isolation, the pandemic simply made visible a reality that had existed for years or decades. The forced physical isolation revealed how emotionally isolated many of us were already living. Now, as we emerge from this collective experience, we have a unique opportunity to reimagine how we want to live and how we want to relate to each other. We can choose to return to the old patterns of superficial technology-mediated connection, or we can use this experience as a catalyst to create more genuine and nurturing forms of community and relationship. Part of this transformation requires that we recognize and address the systematic ways our current society is hostile to emotional healing. We live in a culture that values productivity over well-being, that sees vulnerability as weakness, that treats symptoms instead of addressing root causes. Our workplaces reward people who suppress their emotional needs in favor of productivity. Our educational systems prioritize academic performance over emotional development. Our media constantly bombards us with images of unrealistic relationships and impossible standards of success. To create a society that genuinely supports healing and connection, we need to question these fundamental priorities. We need to create spaces where it is safe to be vulnerable, where time for healing is valued, where healthy relationships are prioritized over individual achievements. This does not mean abandoning ambition or progress. It means recognizing that true progress includes our ability to form healthy bonds and to support the emotional flourishing of all members of society. Each day that passes, more research confirms what indigenous peoples have always known, that we are fundamentally interconnected beings, that our individual health is inextricably linked to the health of our communities, and that unhealed wounds perpetuate through generations until they are consciously addressed and transformed. The childhood wounds that shape the isolated adult are not just personal problems, they are symptoms of a society that has lost the wisdom of how to create and support emotionally healthy human beings. But here is the liberating truth I want to leave you with. The fact that these wounds were created relationally means they can be healed relationally. The fact that our patterns of isolation were learned means that new patterns of connection can be learned. The fact that our brain was shaped by past experiences means it can be reshaped by new experiences. Neuroplasticity offers us the possibility of rewriting our emotional programming, no matter how many years we have lived with the old patterns. This healing process is neither quick nor easy, but it is profoundly possible. Each person who chooses to face their childhood wounds and do the work of healing not only transforms their own life, they break a cycle that could have continued through generations. Each healthy relationship we manage to form offers evidence to other people that genuine connection is possible. Each act of courageous vulnerability creates space for others to be equally courageous. The epidemic of isolation in our society is not an intractable problem or an inevitable consequence of modernity. It is the predictable result of practices that can be changed, of systems that can be transformed, of patterns that can be interrupted. But this transformation begins with individuals courageous enough to look honestly at their own wounds and committed enough to do the work of healing not just for themselves, but for the future generations who will be affected by their choices. If these reflections have touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that your journey toward healing and genuine connection is one of the most important works you can do, not just for yourself, but for all those whose lives will be touched by yours. By subscribing to this channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your commitment to genuine emotional growth and personal transformation. Each week, we explore together not just the roots of our deepest challenges, but also the practical paths toward healing and flourishing. This is not just a space for understanding our problems. It is a space for finding and implementing real solutions. Subscribe to continue this journey together, because the healing the world needs begins with individuals courageous enough to do their own deep inner work. The wounded child within each isolated adult is still waiting to be seen, understood, and finally healed. It is not too late to offer them what they always needed: safe presence, unconditional acceptance, and the experience that genuine connection is not only possible, but is our fundamental right as human beings. Isolation may have been our survival strategy, but connection is where we find our fullest humanity and our truest potential.
Philosophers like Charles Taylor and psychologists and others, they looked into this kind of mental atom of the self and realized, like the physical atom, it's not solid at all. It contains not just multitude of subparticles, but they are constantly moving and interacting and changing.
Did it help you understand something about yourself?
Yes, that and what I define as myself itself needs a lot more exploration. You think you know yourself, but you don't. Not just, the kind of individual events of your life. your very understanding of what is a self is far from self-evident. And it is itself the product of a lot of stories and mythologies which are not necessarily true.
How can humanity flourish in the era of AI? The answer is simple. Together, humans can control AI. But if we fight one another, AI will control us. Therefore, we should build more trust between humans before we develop truly super intelligent AI agents. Unfortunately, at present, we are doing exactly the opposite. All over the world, trust between humans is collapsing. The crisis of trust results from a big misunderstanding. Too many countries think that to be strong means to trust no one and to be completely separated from the others. But complete separation is impossible. Indeed, in nature, complete separation is death. Think about the human body as an example. Every minute, we breathe in and out, in and out. Every breath we take is a small gesture of trust in what is outside us. We take air from the outside into our lungs, into our body, and later give it back to the universe. This trusting in and out movement is the rhythm of life. If we distrust everything outside us and therefore stop this in and out movement, we die.
They suddenly feel that they cannot rely anymore on the international order. They cannot rely anymore on America. For most of history, governments, whether of democracies or of dictatorships, of empires or city-states, almost all governments spent more than 50% of their budget on the military. In the early 21st century, countries felt so safe that the average expenditure on the military was just about 6 or 7% of the government budget all over the world. In contrast, about 10% of the budget was spent on healthcare. This was the first time in human history that governments spent more on healthcare, on nurses and doctors and hospitals, than they spent on the military, on soldiers and warships and fortresses. And unfortunately, this is now changing. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with policies of the Trump administration, countries again feel unsecure. They feel the only thing that protects us against invasion and conquest by a stronger country is if we have a bigger military. And countries in Europe, countries in East Asia and elsewhere, they suddenly feel that they cannot rely anymore on the international order. They cannot rely anymore on America. They have to increase their military budgets, build bigger armies. And of course, if everybody does it, you'll have an arms race and the situation will just keep deteriorating.